Hey, Gihan. I looked at the strategy phase, I went through it, and I identified the problems that I have in my organization. So I'm going to move my workloads into Azure. So see ya.
Whoa! Hold your horses, Muditha. Not that fast.
What do you mean not that fast, Gihan? I I found out the problems. I got the business justification. The business gave me the approval. What more do I need? I'm just going to go migrate my stuff.
No, so that's what we're going to talk about today.
Oh. Welcome to another episode of Azure Demystified. My name is Muditha.
And I'm Gihan.
So, Gihan, that was one of the questions our customers have when they are through with the strategy phase, isn't it? If I can't move my workloads to Azure now, what should I be doing next?
Of course, once you're done with the strategy phase, you need to plan on how you're going to migrate your workloads.
So, the next question is what's planning? What do I have to plan? How do I do that? And that's what we are going to talk about in this episode. And to clear out all these questions and concerns our viewers have about the next steps.
Yep. So when it comes to planning, we must look at several factors in your organization. Addition to these factors, there are several tools at our disposal. And using these tools, we can have a solid foundation to begin the cloud journey. We do not plan on going very deep into the functionality of these tools, but we will provide an overview. If you guys want us specifically to go through these tools in depth, we can in a future episode. So please comment below if you want to.
So, before we dive into today's content, Gihan, let's give a shout out to our sponsor, Lunavi.
Today's episode is sponsored by Lunavi, an IT consulting firm and an MSP that helps organizations achieve digital transformations from the data center to DevOps. Lunavi offers a broad range of services from cloud enablement and infrastructure modernization to leading app development and data analytics services. Lunavi's expert consultants and support staff extend your IT team to deliver next generation technology in a better way. Not only delivering solutions but also sharing knowledge so you leave every engagement with stronger operations than you started. Learn more by visiting www.lunavi.com today.
So, full disclosure, both Gihan and I work at Lunavi as solution consultants. However, none of our thoughts and opinions discussed in this episode have been influenced by Lunavi. So, our thoughts and opinions are our own, and they do not reflect that of our employer or its partners. Now, that is out of the way. Let's open the room for Gihan to take us through the planning phase.
Right. So the cloud adoption plan converts the aspirational goals of the cloud adoption strategy into actions. It will help guide technical efforts in alignment with the business strategy. So there are four uh, phases to the planning. Number one being rationalized digital estate. Number two being initial org alignment. Number three being skills readiness plan. And number four being the cloud adoption plan. So these are the four steps that we will be looking at in more detail in the upcoming slides. When it comes to rationalized digital estate, so the first thing you need to think about is the 5 R's, right? So what are the 5 R's? The 5 R's are mainly rehost, refactor, re-architect, rebuild, and replace. So what do I mean by this? This is how you should look at your applications. So if you take, let's say, a web server, are you going to rehost it? So rehosting just means lift and shift. So you take, if it's a VM that is running on-prem, we just transfer the VM onto Azure, and then we continue it as a web server in Azure. So that's just about rehosting. So you're not making any changes to the application. You're just doing a lift of the VM and transferring it through a migration tool onto Azure, right? So the next option is refactoring. So refactoring is when you modernize your application somewhat. So let's say you had a VM running a web server on-prem, but now you are going to make it into a web app, right? So web app and Azure web app is a PaaS service that is available. So changing that is called refactoring. So that is the second R. Then we have the third R, which is re-architect. So what that means is any old applications that are on-prem, you make it cloud compatible, right? Um, you would ask why, what are the reasons you would want to re-architect, right? You would want to re-architect an application if your application is cloud compatible but not cloud native, right? uh, if you want to improve your scale and agility, so if you want to make sure that there are improvements to your application, you will go with the re-architect process. If you want to make it easier to adopt new cloud capabilities, also if you want a mix of technology stacks, then you would go with the re-architect option. Then we have the next R, which is rebuild. You would rebuild an application if you can't justify further investment of that application. So you finally decide, okay, there is no point trying to change this application or modifying this application. We are going to rebuild from scratch, right? So that's when you would do a rebuild. And the next option is the replace option. So the replace option basically means you replace an application with for reasons, let's say for example, you have Exchange on-prem, right? And you have the SaaS option of Office 365, right? So you can choose to run Exchange Server on-prem, but the SaaS option in Office 365 will give you the latest and greatest Exchange version online. So that would be a reason to replace that application. So there are other reasons, like let's say you really don't want to manage that application or keep developing that application, and you have a replacement application available online or available as a third party source, then you would go with that replace option. Next, we will be taking an incremental approach, right? So the power of 10 basically means you take 10 workloads and then you add it to the backlog to start using in the migration. So a workload is basically group of applications that work for a common cause. So for example, a web app will have front end application and a database, so and the client application at sometimes. So there could be multiple applications that are working together for one workload, right? So that is what a workload means. The next is we need to uh, output take an output of the rationalization effort and create a prioritized backlog. So basically the backlog will help you to ensure that we keep everything monitored and go through the migration process. So we need to ensure that we have the costing in place, right? So we can utilize tools like the Azure Migrate. Azure Migrate is a migration tool that will also give you an estimate of the costing. So it will, once the VMs are selected in Azure Migrate, it will show the costing based on your criteria. And also we have the total cost of ownership calculator, which you can enter in your data and get an idea of the cost of running things. Also, the Azure pricing calculator. The Azure pricing calculator, you can put in the workloads, the resources that you're going to use in Azure, and get you the costing from that as well. So the difference between the total cost of ownership versus the pricing calculator is The Azure pricing calculator is all about the Azure pricing for its resources, whereas the total cost of ownership is for you to identify how much you're going to how much it's going to cost if you're going to run the same workload that you're currently running on-prem in Azure, right? So there's a slight difference. So the total cost of ownership will teach you or give you the values of how much you're going to save at the end of the day after migrating to Azure. So next, before we move on to the second slide of it, I want to touch upon what a digital estate is. A digital estate is uh, nothing more than resources or assets like virtual machines, servers, applications, data. So it's basically a collection of IT assets that power business processes and supporting operations. So you can just think of it as an abstract reference to a collection of tangible owned assets. So basically, it's what you have within your environment that is digital. Yeah, in the most simplest terms, right?
All right. So next up is the initial organizational alignment. So once you are in the planning stage, planning phase, once you have rationalized your digital state, you have assessed your existing environment, and then figured out what you have in your environment, and then you need to have this initial organizational alignment within your teams. Why do we need that alignment? Is because the cloud adoption in your organization is going to be pretty new to most of your teams, because if you had an on-premises data center and this is the first time that you're going to adopt a cloud environment, then there are going to be some friction between your teams. True organizational alignment, it takes time. Once you have migrated your workloads to the cloud, and it takes a while for your organization and its teams to pretty much align properly with the cloud environment. However, the initial alignment is going to be pretty important during your initial stages during the adoption, or rather the migration, because it is what's going to determine at the end of the day how smooth of a migration that your organization is going to have, or how hard or difficult migration is your organization going to have. So basically, the initial best practice structure is that you're going to create balance between the speed and control. So basically, what speed is, your cloud adoption teams, or else the teams who are performing the migrations, the teams who are adopting the application that have been migrated, versus the governance team who's going to control. Okay, so am I going to let anyone migrate anything to the cloud, everything to the cloud, or am I going to have some control over what's going to be in the cloud, and what are the controls and protections rather that I'm going to apply to these workloads? So you need to have this balance between the teams. So we would call these two teams cloud adoption and cloud governance. Both teams have to come into a mutual agreement as to what form of a speed that you guys want, and what form of a control that you guys want, right? These teams are going to have, in the beginning of this migration, in the beginning of this journey to cloud, there's going to be some sort of a friction. So it is natural, so pretty much the cloud governance teams are going to be consisting of your information security team, auditors, and the sort of staff in your organization, teams in your organization. And the cloud adoption team is going to consist of engineers, or the cloud consultants, architects, developers, who are going to migrate their existing workloads into Microsoft Azure, and end users as well. And they want to migrate these workloads. They want to migrate them fast, because end of the day, these teams want to migrate them as fast as possible to the cloud. But at the same time, the information security teams, the cloud governance team in the cloud adoption framework, they are going to come and put a barrier. Hold on, you're not going to go that fast. We do not want you to migrate everything at once without assessing the current configuration, the security configuration there. How are you going to migrate? What are you migrating? Do you have the proper naming conventions? Do you have the proper resource group structure? Do you have the proper management group structure? All of which we're going to talk about in the next episode in the governance phase, because even though we are in the planning phase right now, the governance, it is going to as if you can remember, so I will link somewhere around here in this video right here right about now to the overview of the cloud adoption framework episode. So there we talked about that the governance phase is going to have involvement from the beginning of the strategy phase up until to the adoption and then beyond that, right? So everything is going to be involved in that, so we will talk about those later on, but the governance team is going to look after those. Do you have everything according to the governance structure that we have established? Do you have the access control in place? What sort of an access control do you need? I mean, at the beginning of the migration, the teams might have, unrestricted access to certain resources, certain areas in Microsoft Azure, to when they are setting up their environment, resource groups, the virtual networks, and whatnot. But once that is done, that has to go. The level of access has to be limited. There has to be only a limited amount of engineers or technicians that is going to access these resources. So the cloud governance team is going to look after that. They are going to make sure that your teams are going to comply with those. So that's why there's going to be a friction at the in the beginning, because the cloud governance teams, they want to enforce all of these controls from the get go. The cloud adoption team, they want to move everything as fast as possible. So you need to have this the balance between, or the mutual agreement between the two teams, the cloud adoption and the cloud governance. When you are starting to migrate to Microsoft Azure, one of the capabilities that newcomers to the cloud tend to overlook is the ability to drive faster migrations or increase the velocity of your migration through automation. So you can pretty much automate everything. You don't have to do everything manual, right? Once you're using the automation in your migration, then you can incorporate those governance policies as well. So that will, that puts that happy face in the governance teams phase, right? So building up the automation, it's going to free up your time, give the greater consistency. So if pretty much every migration or every workload that you migrate will be consistent, the structure in the environment is going to be consistent across. During this organizational alignment, initial organizational alignment, you have to map people to their capabilities. uh, when it comes to people, it can be an individual person or it can be a team. So what person or group of people or the team will be responsible for completing a specific task, the technical tasks in the cloud adoption plan? Who's going to be accountable for the team's ability to deliver the technical changes required in the organization? Who's going to be responsible for the implementing the security, the information security principles, or the compliance or the governance policies in the environment? Any other capabilities or teams or people that have accountability or responsibility within the cloud adoption plan? So those are some of the key areas that you have to work or look at when you are mapping your people with capabilities. So once you have come up with the plan how you're going to get your teams aligned, the cloud adoption and cloud governance, the key two teams, you can start with the migration. However, one thing that you have to understand is that your cloud adoption is not going to stay the same throughout your business life cycle. It has to evolve to keep up with the organization's changing needs, right? There are many critical functions that will have to be addressed in the future, and they might not need to have dedicated teams, but you have to make sure that they are going to, in the future, these requirements, these critical functions are going to be um, handled by someone in the organization. So these teams are going to be responsible for driving the direction and the business alignment in your organization. So some of the teams are the you can have a cloud center of excellence, which is going to ensure that you are addressing the cultural change, skills, and systems needed to help build your cloud competency. The governance, defining the controls to manage risk or minimize the risk in your organization with the cloud. Automation, basically, that ensures the consistency throughout the life cycle, so you can implement your deployments through the template files, and then you use the automation tools in Azure to pretty much automate everything that you want to do.
So let's go through the skills readiness plan. So basically, cloud computing is a technology shift, right? So you're moving from the usual on-prem management of servers and resources into a different uh, technology, which is far more advanced. So first thing you need to do is identify the gaps. First, you need to identify what are the skills that you need, and check with your resources that are in your team to see whether they have the resources. If they don't have the resources, maybe you have a different team. Maybe the dev team have some of the resources. Maybe another application team have some of the resources. So if those teams have part of the part of the skills that are required, maybe it's time to unify those skills, or maybe have internal learnings where you have a knowledge sharing session and you get them up to speed so that everybody is in a good level when it comes to skills. So it's ideal that you need to create an organization learning plan. So there are enough resources provided by Microsoft. There are enough certifications that you can do to get skilled in these areas. Certifications definitely help you cover up missing gaps. um, and of course the learning that you do within your teammates and within an environment, right?
Definitely.
So those are the things that you need to keep in mind and move forward.
Awesome. All right, so that brings us to the fourth step in the planning phase, right? Creating the cloud adoption plan. So this is the actual plan that we are going to have. We are going to use throughout the next two phases: the ready phase and the adoption phase as well. In the when it comes to the plan, the cloud adoption plan, there are few components that are part of this plan, right? So you have the prerequisites, you have the defining and prioritizing workloads, you have the asset alignment, you have the rationalization review, you have the iterations and releases definition, and you have the timeline estimations as well. So let's take a look at each of these as to what they are, what each of these components do in this cloud adoption plan. So the prerequisite when it the prerequisite part in the cloud adoption plan is going to confirm that all of the prerequisite steps have been completed before you create your plan. So the strategic inputs like the motivations, outcomes, the business justifications, those are included in the those are covered already. And then the tactical input, the digital state rationalization, organization management, skill readiness, everything. So all up to now, including the strategy phase, and the first three steps in the planning phase also, they have to have covered, or you have to completely go through those before you come into the plan, before you create the plan. So the prerequisite, make sure that you have covered all those steps that you had that you have in the strategy plan, the strategy phase, as well as in the first three phases in the plan phase. And once you have done that, then you will be able to define and prioritize your workload. So as Gihan explained earlier, a workload is a collection of IT assets, servers, virtual machines, applications, or whatnot. They collectively support a defined process, right? So you have to prioritize your first 10 workloads. So Gihan again explained to you about the power of 10. So you can pick your first 10 workloads and establish an initial adoption backlog. And then you have to align your assets to workload. So a workload again is a conceptual description of a collection of assets. Again, as if I take the example what Gihan explained, a web server, right? So the web server, if you take the simple two-tier web application, you have the front end and the back end. So you have your web portal where users interact with, and then you have your database in the back end, right? So combine those two, that becomes the workload, right? um, and then when you have identified your workload, so we'll call it that the application XYZ, and you have identified that XYZ as a workload, and now you have to map what are the resources or the assets that belong to the XYZ application. So what are those? Your front end web application and your back end database server. So those are the two assets that belongs to the XYZ workload. So you have to make this map. Okay, so these servers or the resources are going to be part of this particular application or the workload. And then you have to review the rationalization decisions. So the decisions that you have taken during the rationalization step, you have to review them. You have to go through them, and then you at this time you have to refine those adoption path decisions, either to migrate or innovate. So lift and shift, pretty easy. You take what you have already in your environment and you just put them back in the cloud environment. And going beyond that, re-architecturing, again, it's all fine. You are not doing much of a change to your application or your workload. You're just looking at how you have hosted that workload in your on-prem environment and make a couple of changes in the cloud environment. And when it comes to refactoring, those are going to go through the innovation process. So you'll have to think about a whole another level. What am I going to do with this application? So I can't just take this application and put that in the cloud, because that the application hasn't been updated in a while. So at this point you have to think about, okay, so what are my alternatives? Do I get somebody else to develop a new application that performs the same functionality, or am I going to look at some application, a software as a service application that I'm going to pay a monthly fee and subscribe to that? So those are some of the things that you have to think about during the rationalization review. And the next step in the cloud adoption plan is that to establish iteration and release plans. So iterations are time blocks allocated to do some work, and then releases are the definitions of the work to be done before triggering a change to production processes. With this, once you have established your iterations and release plans, you can estimate your timelines. So it is really helpful when you have that timeline established. You know that you will have to complete your work within these iterations that you have defined. So establishing a time frame, it is really important. So once you have established that, you can pretty much give an idea to the business, to the organization. So this is what you can expect, and this is how long it's going to take for us to migrate our workloads. And so in this, with these steps or the components included in the cloud adoption plan, you can face the migrations without fear. So you can go confidently to your migration and start migrating your workloads, and let your users adopt the cloud. And then at the during the planning phase, there are several tools that you can use. Namely, you can use the data migration assistant, Azure Migrate, and the service map.
So Microsoft has provided certain tools. We are only covering a few of these tools here, but so the data migration assistant is one of those tools. So the data migration assistant will make sure that you can evaluate your uh, data related workloads, mainly SQL, whether it can go into a uh, Azure SQL database or Azure SQL instance, or maybe there's no choice, but you need to go into a VM instance where SQL is run, right? So all this will be done by the help of this tool. So you don't really need to worry your head too much. When you load it to the tool, it will tell you, okay, this is missing this component. You will need to make these changes in your codes. If you change the queries, then you can maybe look at the pass option. But if the change is too big, then you will need to go with the IS option. So it's fantastic. Just take a look. You just need to enter in the details. It's a very simple tool. You just need to run it uh, on the SQL Server, preferably because it has direct access to it. But even if you don't run it directly, as long as you can reach it, it's fine. So run those tools and see, and have an idea of that. So when it comes to Azure Migrate, it's a similar tool. It'll get in the data that is in your VM host. It could be VMware, it could be Hyper-V, and it'll assess what sort of machines that are required. So it'll even calculate the CPU, memory, and the disk that you need in Azure. So you don't need to worry about, okay, I gave this machine 4 GB. Do I need to give? Do I need to remember that I need to give it 4 GB? No. So what what it will do is it'll monitor. If you keep it running for a couple of days, it will monitor the performance and get that performance data, and even recommend you the CPU sizes that you should be going with. So on prem, maybe you have not monitored it, right? Maybe you just defined the VM with 64 GB of RAM, and you just left it at that. Maybe you didn't really monitor it, right? But in Azure, it's vital that you monitor it, because each resource is going to cost you, right? If you over provision resources, it's going to cost you. So the better thing to do is to save money, right? Everybody wants to save money, so reduce the cost. So we don't want to over provision servers, because if it's needed, like if you feel that you still need more RAM or more CPU power, or more disk power, you can always change it, right? So it's better to reduce it and see whether you can actually run it at that level, so that it will reduce the overall cost of the VM. The third tool that we're going to talk about is the service map. The service map, if I remember correctly, it's going to be deprecated in 2025, I think. But uh, but at the moment you can use it, because service map is going to be replaced with another tool. Service map, currently what it does is it gets you all the connect. So once you install the agent, it will tell you all the connections that are happening to and from the server. So for example, let's say there's a web server and a database server. If there are requests coming in, it will identify that from this particular resource, requests are coming in on this particular port, and so on. So it's a very valuable tool to map out your data stream, to see how the data flow is going, right? So to see which ports are being opened, which ports are being utilized. So you can have an idea once you move it to Azure, that you're not blocking required ports that are needed for communication.
Perfect. So that really helps to, once someone is done identifying their motivations around why they need to migrate to Azure, and come up with the business justification, and then got the green light from the business to pretty much, okay, so go ahead and migrate our workloads, then we can come up with this plan. We have to plan this around the workloads, and as I said, the rationalization, the initial organizational alignment, skill gap, and then come up with the cloud adoption plan, which is going to stay throughout the adoption, the journey. So what are we going to talk in the next episode, Gihan?
So next episode we are going to cover governance, which is being. Uh, I mean, we promised it earlier, but then we put it back because we wanted to keep the order of process going. So we'll make sure that we are covering governance in this next episode, which is going to cover the naming conventions, the theory behind management groups, subscriptions, and the thinking behind it. So all that good information will be covered in that session.
All right, folks. Thank you for staying with us. Comment below or email us to team@azure-demystified.com to let us know your feedback, what you think about our show, what you would like to see from our show. Links to all the resources, again, as we mentioned earlier, will be down in the description. Subscribe to the channel, spread the word, and stay tuned for our next episode. Till then, have a good week, and we will see you with a brand new episode next week. Bye.
Goodbye.